Hello everybody, we are coming in for the video for this week. Since I did not really get any ideas, I kind of went through my own thoughts over what I thought might be a topic we might want to discuss, and I decided to do one a little earlier on than most of our videos. I mean, we should probably go through all history, and I'm going to try to actually focus on that a little more as of late. I'm going to try to focus on getting some more the back prior to 1600 or prior to 1700 history in here, or even back to ancient times if we really can't get to it. So I'm going to try to incorporate some older history topics that aren't as recent, and that's going to be one goal I hope to work on here a little bit. But anyway, in today's topic, it's kind of bordering on the historical and the religious a little bit. I don't know if this is going to affect anybody. It shouldn't. But today we are going to go over the Reformation, or the Reformation, however you want to say it. And this was a religious movement that began in the 16th century, about 1517, so the 1500s, and the Reformation is basically the start of Protestantism. Now, if you don't know what Protestantism is, a lot of your churches today, if you're Christian and you're not part of the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, you are probably Protestant. Protestant incorporates many branches. It is an offshoot of Catholicism. However, during the Reformation, a bunch of Christian thinkers and priests and others began to band together and began to realize there were problems with the Catholic Church at the time. I'm not saying there still are now, but at the time at least there were some problems with the Catholic Church that were not being solved, and they had grown tired of this, and they tried to break away and form their own churches. Of course, this did lead to violence in Europe, and we will discuss that slightly. So, this is the Reformation. I do apologize if you're not exactly the religious type and you might not understand any of this, but regardless if you are religious or not, it does play a role in a modern world because it explains to you where these different churches come from. I'm sure if you're non-religious or religious, or either one, you've heard of different kinds of church. You've heard of Methodists, you've heard of Presbyterians, you've heard of Quakers, Puritans, Anglicans, what's another one? Mennonites, Amish. Oh, who else have we heard of here? Pentecostals. You've probably heard of a lot of these people. And this Lutherans is another. Lutherans, Calvinists. You've probably heard a lot of these different kinds of churches, and you wonder why are there so many different churches? Well, this all stems from the Reformation, and we'll go over what that is today. So, as I stated, the Reformation is a religious slash revolutionary movement that begins in the year 1517 in Europe. And this is all in Europe. None of it happens outside of Europe really yet. And in fact, most of all that we're going to talk about is in Europe. So in 1517, we have to go over the religious climate at that time. And at the time, the Roman Catholic Church, there were only two branches of the Christian church. Christianity had two major branches at this time in history, prior to 1517. And you had the Roman Catholic Church, which was based in Rome, or the Vatican. It had the Pope, had the papacy, the cardinals, all these Catholic figures, and that was in Western Europe, anything west of Germany. Then you had the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was based in the Byzantine Empire, which was basically the Eastern Roman Empire, which was based in the city of Constantinople, which is now the modern-day city of Istanbul, Turkey, and the Eastern Orthodox Church is now centered in Russia today. Yes, I know Russia is not exactly one of the best relative places, but after the fall of the Byzantines in 1453, the Eastern Orthodox's headquarters shifted to Russia. Russia is now today the largest of the Eastern Orthodox countries. And that is where you don't have the popes, but you have like the decorative eggs and stuff like that. You get a lot more Eastern Greek view to Christianity, whereas Roman Catholicism is more Latin in its source, and Eastern Orthodox is Greek, kind of, in its set form. So anyway, these are the two major churches. They had never gotten along, but what we're going to discuss is the Roman Catholic Church. So discard Eastern Europe here. Anything east of Germany, so like Poland, Hungary, Let me think here. Russia, the Byzantine Empire at the time. Discard them. This does not happen in them. This happens in the Western European countries that follow Roman Catholicism. And the Roman Catholic Church was probably the most powerful entity in Europe at that time. It was the most unifying entity in Europe. I mean, there were separate countries in Europe, but the church back then played a much larger role. It was almost like a political force. And I say this the church, the Roman Catholic Church, the popes and his papacy, they heavily influenced the politics of the different kingdoms across Europe, from England to France to Spain to the Italian little kingdoms that was there, the Holy Roman Empire, which stood where Germany is now. They dominated a lot of this, and by dominate, I mean if the Pope issued something that he thought was better for that country, it almost was like a godsend that it had to happen, that the Pope said so we got to do so. So regardless of who your monarchy was or who your leader was, it was almost like the ultimate authority lay with the Pope. The Roman Catholic Church was the main, it kind of cast the big shadow over all these nations, saying, okay, you can be sovereign, but the church is expected to be given sovereignty over you. And there were a lot of bad things that began happening with the church, mostly due to the church needed some fundraising to improve St. Peter's Basilica, how they say it. I do apologize. I'm not Catholic myself, so I don't know all these terms. In fact, here I will reveal that now what I am, and this will come up. In my family, we are Pentecostal, which we are not Catholic, so we are Protestant Pentecostals. So we will discuss where that I will show where Pentecostals come from at the end of this video. I do have a small little chart that kind of shows you where all the different Protestant branches come off from. So anyway, the church is going through tough times. It needs to raise money in order to do these renovations and everything else. Well, the church had a lot of corrupt practices. There were corrupt papacy officials, there were corrupt cardinals, there were popes that readily wanted to start a war just because they thought it would better Christianity. And unfortunately, one of the biggest crimes that the church was really doing was the sale of indulgences. And sale of indulgences, do pardon my language and my grammar. Now, you might ask, what is an indulgence? Well, the Catholic Church at this time had made a practice of selling indulgences, and what indulgences were basically, you give the church a little bit of money, prepaid amount that they tell you can pay them, and you give them a little bit of money, and the church would say that in return for paying them this money, you were forgiven of one sin. I don't know. I think I'm safe to say this now because I think even Roman Catholics today kind of realize this was a wrong practice, and that I think if anyone that's in the Christian religion kind of realizes, people cannot forgive other people of sin. I'm delving a little into the religious aspect of it here, so I do apologize if you're not religious, but I am. But according to Christian tradition, people cannot forgive other people of sin. It is only God the Father that can do this. Only God up high can forgive people of sin. So for the church to be selling indulgences and basically saying that in return for this payment you are forgiven of one sin, it is not right. It's kind of a heresy, I guess would be the word you'd put, because it's not of God forgiving you, it's man, which means you're not really forgiven of anything. And the church is doing this for money, which is even worse. So this and many other practices, they start a lot, and of course, the kingdoms in Europe is another source. The kingdoms, keep in mind, we said that the Catholic Church is being like the supreme political authority across Europe. Well, of course, that's going to make, in some countries, some of these monarchs, like in England and France, they're kind of not exactly all for having that although they're the supposed leader of their country, they're still supposedly answerable to the Pope. They don't like that. And of course, this creates unrest. And on top of these malpractices, this only creates further unrest and grievances against the Roman Catholic Church and Catholicism as a general source. So in 1517, this is when the Reformation really begins, and this is the year that a certain monk, a German monk by the name of Martin Luther, no, not Martin Luther King Jr., we're just going to say Martin Luther, this is his name. This was before him. He was a German monk. He was also a university lecturer at the city of Wittenberg, I think, was his city. Wittenberg. It looks like Wittenberg, but I'm pronouncing it with the German, and I'm guessing from what I've learned of German, Germans usually pronounce the W with a V sound, so I'm going to say Wittenberg. And he was a university lecturer at the college there, but he was also a monk at the monastery there. And he kind of was, like many across Europe, he was very, how to put this, aghast at what the church was doing. He was very incensed by its activities, and he had finally gotten to the point that he was openly criticizing the Catholic Church and its indulgence practices. And Luther finally, he did something that none had ever done before him. And there had been those who had spoke out before, but none had ever really done anything significant other than speaking. On October 31st, 1517, the day or two before All Saints' Day, which is like November 1st, November 2nd, which today we know October 31st as Halloween. But anyway, on October 31st of 1517, Luther actually went to the Castle Church in his hometown of Wittenberg, which was the main Roman Catholic Church there, and he nailed 95 complaints that he had formulated against the church. He nailed 95 of these complaints to the church door of what the church was doing wrong, what was wrong with the church, and why this shouldn't be done. He had 95 he could come up with on a handwritten list that he nailed to the door, except instead of calling them complaints, Luther called these theses. So today we know these as the 95 theses. Luther in his theses insisted that the Pope possessed no authority to issue the indulgences, and that the merits of saints in the Roman Catholic Church had no foundation in the gospel section of the New Testament. Luther declared that Scripture alone was authoritative, and justification was by faith and not works, basically saying the church was giving people justification that they were going to be okay and they were going to go to heaven by working, when in reality, you're not getting that. In reality, it should be by your faith, not by how much you work. Luther, upon listing these theses, he had only originally desired to speak out against the church. He had no other premonition to do anything else. He just wanted to get his mind spoken, cleared, and just wanted to let the church know, hey, you're doing something wrong. Here's what you're doing wrong. Well, the church didn't take too kindly to being chastised. The Roman Catholic Church was never one back then for being told that it was wrong. And in response to this, Luther got more than he bargained for. And in 1521, just a couple years later, he was actually excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and there were calls that went out for Luther to be arrested for heresy. Now, excommunication is what the Roman Catholic Church did back then. I don't know if they still do it today. They probably do in some cases, but excommunication is basically saying you're kicked out of the church. You can never come back. You are a heretic. Get out of the church. You're out. It's just a fancy word for saying, yeah, we kicked you out. They excommunicated him. They kicked him out just because he told them what they were doing wrong. He pointed out their failure and their wrongdoings. Now, Luther was granted protection in Saxony, which was a kingdom in what is now Germany, and was part of the Holy Roman Empire at the time, and he continued his publication of anti-Catholic pamphlets and translated the Bible into German, which was a big momentous thing because of the fact it was the first time that the Bible had really been translated into something that the common people could read. It wasn't the first time it had been translated from something other than Latin, but it was the first time that it had been translated from something that the common people could read. Because in most Roman Catholic churches back in the day, the common practice was that the common people didn't get to have a Bible. They heard what the preacher or whoever was the sermon, leading the sermon, whatever he said is what went. The people did not like today, where you can have a Bible in your hand. So this was big back then. Luther did this to kind of get more and more people able to have the Bible in their hand. German peasants, in particular, took Luther's messages and theses to heart, and they took his ideas in full. And in 1524, they revolted, just 3 years after the church had excommunicated Luther. Now, Luther did side with the Holy Romans at this time to suppress the revolts, because he didn't think they were right. He thought they were violent, that it wasn't right to be overthrowing authority in such a manner, just on the basis of God. So he kind of ignored all of that and sided with them. But after the revolts were over, Luther and his followers began the first major branch of Protestantism that is today known as Lutheranism. I'm sure you probably know a Lutheran church if you have ever gone around. And this was spread across, and eventually Lutheranism basically became the main religion in Germany and Scandinavia and the Baltics. So, especially in Germany, it's still strong today. So it's really the first major branch of Protestantism that breaks away from the Roman Catholic Church. And what Lutheranism does, and Calvinism, which we're about to discuss here as well, is the main difference between that and the Roman Catholic Church is that Calvinism and Lutheranism, they emphasize the importance of preaching during worship. That preaching is important. In 1519, a Reformation movement also began in Switzerland, which was led by a man by the name of Ulrich Zwingli, who paralleled Luther's ideas, that the Pope possessed no authority to give indulgences, the Catholic Church was not the supreme head over everything, along those lines. Now, certain more radical groups emerged in Switzerland, and one of these groups, for example, was the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists believed that baptism shouldn't even be performed on an infant. Many churches today, like how some of you may ask your parents, was I baptized when I was born? And your parents might say, well, I baptized you when you were a baby, or when you were a year old or so, when you were an infant. Well, the Anabaptists believe that this should not be performed on infants, and that baptism should only be performed on an adult who professed their faith in Jesus Christ. And the Anabaptists did face persecution throughout the 16th century due to this view, but they managed to survive. And today they include both the Mennonites and the Hutterites, and of course the Amish, since they are kind of descended from the Mennonites. So this is where the Mennonites come from. If you live here in the United States or in Ohio, where I live right now, we see all kinds of Mennonites around my area. We do see some Amish at times, but we see a lot of Mennonites. But that's what they basically believe. Of course, there's a little more to their religion, but the core of their religion is that they believe that baptism, it should not be performed when you are an infant. It should only be performed when you are an adult and you have professed a faith in Jesus. Now, another major Protestant branch, and the other major one that comes out of the Reformation, evolves, and that also comes from Switzerland. And this is when Protestant lawyer John Calvin, he comes from France. He is a Frenchman, and he flees France in the 1530s because France is heavily Roman Catholic, and thus he's kind of persecuted in his home country. He doesn't see it as right, and Switzerland rapidly kind of becoming this Protestant haven, and he of course flees across the French and Swiss border to come to Switzerland to live and escape that persecution. Now, while Calvin is there, he writes down many theological works and develops his own little belief that eventually becomes the foundation for what we now know as Calvinism, which becomes the other major Protestant branch that comes out of the Reformation. Well, actually, I say three. There is a third one. Calvin, basically, this is where he forms it. He even gets invited to live in the Swiss capital of Geneva, and that's where he begins to practice his personal doctrine, which forms Calvinism. Now, what does Calvin believe? Calvin stressed that God's power and the predetermined fate of humanity as stated in the Bible. So he stressed that God was all-powerful. There was nothing that was going to beat the Almighty God the Heavenly Father, and that the predetermined fate of humanity that the Bible states in Revelation of what's going to happen on the Battle of Armageddon, how the world's going to end, he stressed this, that you cannot change what the Bible says. The Bible says that humanity is doomed unless it repents and comes and serves the Lord faithfully. If it forgets the Lord, it will be cast into hellfire and destroyed at the Battle of Armageddon when that happens. Basically saying that humanity cannot determine its own fate because its fate has already been predetermined by the Heavenly Father. Calvin rapidly did gain followers upon starting to preach his little doctrine of philosophy, and in the city of Geneva became a huge mess of Protestant exiles that flocked to Calvin's message. Calvinism eventually did spread across Switzerland. It spread to Scotland, up north of England, which was a separate country at that time. It spread to France. It spread to Transylvania, which is today a region in Romania. No, not Dracula, although that's supposedly where he lived. And the Low Countries, which is like Belgium and the Netherlands, especially in the Netherlands. Calvinism was actually very popular in the Netherlands, very popular. By the mid-16th century, the Reformation was definitely underway after the innovations of Lutheranism and Calvinism had come into play, and Lutheranism was dominating Northern Europe mostly, more than Calvinism was. Now, Catholic authority did remain strong in Spain and Italy, because these countries were heavily Catholic. Of course, Italy, the Pope is like right there, so that's not really going to change. And of course, in Spain, the monarchs themselves were heavily Catholic, so they weren't going to change. And in Spain and Italy are really the only two Western European countries that didn't experience any bit of a major religious upheaval movement. They remained largely loyally Catholic. Now, England is our third hot zone that's going to happen. And before we get to England, I will mention that in Scotland, just north of England, when Calvinism arrived, it was the main religion. But Calvinism eventually kind of got warped a little bit by another theological thinker. Let me see if I got his name here. I might. I hope I do. A theologist named John Knox in Scotland kind of evolved Calvinism a little bit, and this is where you get Presbyterianism, which became the dominant religion up in Scotland. And it was influenced by Calvinism. So that's where you get the Presbyterians. I hope I'm saying that name right. And the Reformation in England was not just religious, but it was also quite political. And this brings us to a very, very famous king, who I'm pretty sure all of us have heard at least one tale of, about him and his 6 wives that he had. And this was none other than big ol' Henry VIII. The guy that had 6 wives and killed 2 of them. Yeah, this is a wonderful man. King Henry VIII, of course, I think you probably all heard the story. If you have, the reason he had 6 wives was partly because the search for his first 3 wives was to produce him a male heir. He wanted a male heir to the throne, not a female. So Henry wanted a male heir to the throne. Well, Henry was so adamant in this that his first wife was Catherine of Aragon. She was from Spain. She was actually the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who, I don't know if you remember this from history class, but they were the king and queen of Spain that financed Christopher Columbus to come over here to the Americas. But that was their daughter. He had married her, and the odd thing is, she was married to his older brother, Arthur. But Arthur had died in a shipwreck about 2 decades earlier, and almost immediately after his death, Henry went after her and married her. Swell! Sure, your brother's rolling in his grave. But anyway, Henry wanted a divorce because after a while, his wife, Catherine, after many attempts to have a child, they did have a child, but unfortunately it was a girl by the name of Mary. Keep attention to this name, as it will come into play later. I think you might know where this is going if you've read history at all about Mary. So Henry immediately he comes to the conclusion that Catherine would never be able to give him a son, that he needs to find another wife, and that maybe she can give him the son, the male heir that he desires. But in order to do so, he needs to divorce Catherine. Well, Henry's already got his eyes set. He has found another woman by the name of Anne Boleyn. However, he must divorce Catherine before doing it. So Henry requests that the Pope annul his marriage, or divorce him, cancel the marriage, annul. Well, Pope Clement VII, who is the Pope at this time, he refuses to annul Henry's marriage due to, A, who Catherine's parents are, because they're some of his biggest supporters, and second, Catherine herself is a very devout Catholic. He is not going to betray that. And there was, of course, other reasons to it, but these were two of the primary reasons why the Pope refused to annul the marriage. Plus, he did not see as reason for not being able to have a male child as a reason for divorce. Well, what does Henry do? Well, Henry gets infuriated by the Pope's refusal to annul his marriage to Catherine, and instead he goes on a long shot. He declares the establishment of his own church. The Church of England, or the Anglican Church, the Anglicans. This is where the Anglicans come from. And the Anglican Church is formed in England as England's church. It is separate from the Catholic Church, and one key way, the Pope does not run this church, the King of England does. So who's the head of this church? King Henry VIII himself. And he forms this in 1534. Henry, now that England supposedly no longer is Catholic, it's following the Anglican Church now, and he is the head of it, annuls his marriage to Catherine by his own authority, divorces her, and he dissolves the English monasteries in England that are the English Catholic monasteries, so he can take their wealth of gold and treasure, and on top of that, he works to provide a Bible to everyone in the country. After Henry died in 1547, his young son that he did eventually get with his third wife who died in childbirth, his name was Edward. Edward VI takes the throne, but he only reigns for 6 years. Edward was a very sickly child. He wasn't although Henry did get the male heir he wanted, Edward was never really constantly healthy. He constantly got sick. He constantly had health problems. And thus, when he became king, he was only a boy when his dad died, so he was literally a boy king and had to have help ruling his country. During Edward's short reign, England became increasingly Protestant. Edward didn't really increase anything from what his father had done, but he didn't do anything to hamper Catholicism further, and he didn't do anything to stop Protestantism because he was raised that way from his dad. He thought it was right. Well, in 6 years, Edward's dead. He dies suddenly at the age of, I think, 15. And this is in 1554. And this is where the Reformation in England, at least, takes kind of a back turn. In 1554, Edward VI dies at the age of 15 years old. Upon his death, his older half-sister Mary, remember Mary, the firstborn child of Henry VIII that he had with Catherine? Well, she takes the throne after a little bit of political maneuvering as Queen Mary I. Now, Mary, like her mother, she's very ardently Catholic. She's not Protestant. And Mary was raised to think that Protestantism was bad by her mother because it led to her father divorcing her mother. And she was treated as a sideliner. And it led to her mother even being banished from England. And Mary got to stay because, of course, she was the king's daughter. And she was never really receptive of her father after that. And she was very Catholic. She wasn't very Protestant at all. And she was so ardent of a Catholic that she eventually married the King of Spain, King Philip. Well, Mary takes a little bit of a blood purge, and she starts purging England of anyone that was deemed to be of a Protestant faith and thus a heretic to Catholicism, and she earns herself the moniker of Bloody Mary. She is the infamous queen that we call Bloody Mary because of the fact that she murdered, anyone that was Protestant in England. If you were Protestant, hang, off of your head, off of your head, off of your head, off of your head. Yeah, this is that queen. She is that Catholic that she is going to that extreme point to try to force England to convert back to Catholicism and not be Protestant. Mary eventually dies in 1559 after a reign of only 5 years. She dies and she is not able to produce a child, so thus she leaves no definitive biological heir, and thus upon her death, just prior to her death, she names her younger half-sister Elizabeth as her heir to the throne. Upon Mary's death, Elizabeth takes the throne as Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was the second child of Henry VIII. She was the daughter of him and Anne Boleyn, and of course, I think you all know this, Henry had wanted a male heir. Well, he thought Anne Boleyn was going to be able to give it to him. Anne Boleyn gave him another daughter. Henry realized it would look very shabby if he went ahead and divorced another woman, and instead he fabricated that Anne had committed a crime against him and had her head cut off. Beheaded her so he could marry another woman. That eventually, the third wife, Jane Seymour, is who gave him Edward. But anyway, Elizabeth, she becomes queen in 1559 upon the death of her older half-sister Mary. Elizabeth's reign, she restores Protestantism to England. She's very Protestant as she was raised by her dad and by her mother for the very short time that she was alive. So she was raised by her dad. She is very Protestant. She believes in the Anglican Church, and she casts the Anglican Church as kind of a middle ground, as the middle choice between strict Protestantism and strict Catholicism. She tries to allow Catholicism and Protestantism. She grants the Catholics religious tolerance in England. She's not going to kick them out like her sister did, like her father did, or anything. But she tries to cast the Anglican Church as kind of a mixing ground between the two. Now, the Counter-Reformation is what we're going to briefly mention here, and that's what happens as the Catholic Church kind of starts stepping up efforts to stop the Reformation. As the Reformation drug on, the Catholic Church soon responded to what it saw as heresy. It saw these new Protestant branches as heresy. They're going against what we have been telling them that they need to do. They're saying all their own words. This ain't from God. They're heretics. They need to be burned at the stake. And new orders, such as the Jesuits, I don't know how you say it. I do apologize. They were formed, and unfortunately, in Rome and Spain, you get the Inquisitions get formed, which is basically they're going to try anybody. They go out there, they find someone that's supposedly Protestant, and they try to forcibly, usually through torture, try to make you either confess to being a heretic or try to convert you back to the Catholic faith. So it was really dark in Spain and Rome at the time. So, yeah, not a good chapter that we like to look at there. And actually, I'm going to probably get a separate video on the Counter-Reformation. I just briefly mentioned it here, but we will probably do a separate video on that because of the Inquisition, how devastatingly brutal it was. But we will probably do a separate video on that. But that is the gist here of the Reformation I wanted to touch on. So basically, it's a political and religious upheaval. Many countries in Europe start following Protestant faith instead of Roman Catholic. Although Spain and Rome, it remains high. A little bit high in France, too. But it really starts the different change in churches. And that's where you get your third branch. There's now 3 main branches of Christianity. You have the Roman Catholicism, you have Eastern Orthodox, and now you have Protestantism. So I want to go here. Right here we have one image today. We have painting of Martin Luther, who really kicked off the Reformation. He was the German monk that is the founder of Lutheranism. He is the one that really kicked all this off, so that's him. And then here, I have a small chart of how the different Protestant groups are kind of related, who descends from who. And this is our little chart, kind of goes by year. We start in 1517 with the Reformation beginning. I'm going to try to read this proficiently. I do apologize if we do something wrong. Woo. Okay. I know that if my mouth goes behind this thing, it's going to block out that voice. So let me see. I hope this is okay. So up here you have where is it? I'm looking at this upside down on the screen. Right here we have Lutheranism, the first branch that kind of comes off, and there's really no branches that really form off Lutheranism. It just kind of continues to the present day. So it goes all the way to today. Then you have Calvinism, which becomes like the second major branch that comes out of this, and Calvinism continues to today. It's still strong on its own, but there's other branches that branch off from Calvinism as the years go on, as the centuries kind of progress here. Up to 2000, I got it. So, like, you have your Continental Reformed churches that come off from this. You have Arminianism. I've never actually heard of that one. And then, of course, I'm sure you've heard of this one. You have the Presbyterians that come off from Calvinism, and that's where they come from. Then we have the Anglicans, the Anglican Church that Henry VIII formed. They go straight. That's where you get Methodists. I'm pretty sure you know Methodists if you live in the United States. I see quite a few Methodist churches. They are descended from the Anglicans. And then, of course, you also, earlier on, the Methodists didn't come around until roughly about in the 1700s. In the 1600s, that's where you get Puritans, the Quakers, and other English dissenters that didn't quite follow the Anglican Church. The Puritans are the people that settled in, that's the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims in Massachusetts. Thanksgiving, they were Puritans. The Quakers, that's the guy on the Quaker Oats guy. They founded the colony of Pennsylvania with William Penn. Ooh, excuse me. And then up here, we also have the Anabaptists. Anabaptism kind of starts right at the Reformation, just kind of goes straight to today with a few deviations. I didn't include the little different offshoots of like Amish or an offshoot. The Amish are an offshoot of the Mennonites, and there is the Hutterites, which I don't know very much about at all. And then, of course, about just before 1600 during the Reformation, you did have the Baptists come into play, which were kind of against the Anabaptists. And the Baptists go straight to the present day as well. And then you wonder, what are these? Well, you have Adventism, which emerges in the 1800s. You have the Holiness Movement, which emerges in the 1800s, which I really don't even know what that is. And then right here you have my branch. You have the Pentecostalism. Now, all this, they are descended from down here. They can trace their roots to Anglicanism. Anglicanism starts right here during about 1534 or so, whenever Henry had split up the church. Anglicanism continues until about here in the 1700s, you have the offshoot of Methodism, the Methodists that come off. So now we're in the Methodists. And it was about the mid-1800s, the mid-19th century, that kind of an offshoot of Methodism, not a direct offshoot, but sort of an offshoot, is where we can trace it. You had Adventism and the Holiness Movement that come off. That comes off in about the mid-19th century, the 1800s. And by the early 1900s, the early 20th century, you have, from the Holiness Movement, you have the Pentecostalism that evolves. So basically, if you want to trace this, if you are Pentecostal or an Adventism or Holiness Movement, whatever those two are, I do apologize, I've never heard of them. But like, especially if you're Pentecostal, you are devolved. You are a descendant, basically. You can trace your religious roots back to the Methodists, who in turn retrace their roots back to the Anglican Church of England. So if you want to really go back far enough, your roots lie with the Anglican Church that was formed during the Reformation. So that is where your roots lie. If you are Lutheran, you've been pretty much straight ever since. If you've been Calvinism, you can either be pretty straight since, or you could go on one of these smaller other fields. Like this one I know is here in the United States, at least. Anabaptism, that's Mennonites, Amish, them, Hutterites. Baptists, I don't know a whole lot about, but they are here in the United States. I've seen that. There's almost every one of these in the United States, really. I'm pretty sure every one of them is. But that's basically, if you're Protestant in any way, this is where, and I'll let you have a close-up here, so you can look it up yourself. This is where your different religion might have come from if you're Protestant. If you're Roman Catholic, you're not on here, because this is Protestant. So I will let you have a close-up look for this for a minute. Try to get as close as I can. Just wanted to give everyone a chance to see that. If you still need to see that, just pause the video, whatever you got to do to look at it, and you can see it from there. But that is the explanation of the Reformation. It's just kind of a religious movement that really gives spawn to the different churches of today. Do excuse me again. So that's what I wanted to cover this week. So we're done with that. As for future videos here, we are going to do one on the Counter-Reformation, or the Inquisition, I guess is what you could call it, of the Catholic response to the Reformation as it happened. Friday, we do, here in America at least, I don't know anything else, if anyone's watching this from any other country, but it is the 19-year anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I will not be putting a historical video on that day. Now, you might ask, well, why not? Well, the more I thought about it, if you've lived in the United States, odds are you know what happened. Either from school, from your parents, you know. You at least know the basics, and I'm not sure I really need to teach people about something that they probably learned pretty early on, because it's highly emphasized in the modern America now. So I really don't think I need to. Such a recent event, and people, they go, you pretty much know. I don't deem it's essential for me to have to teach it to you, because you probably should know it by now. But I will put a video online that day, just out of remembrance for that day and what happened. We will be doing a small remembrance video for the victims of 9/11 and their families. So that's just kind of a remembrance video like we done for the end of World War II and stuff like that. I do want to do a small remembrance video to say that we are acknowledging what happened that day. It's just we're not going to teach, because most of us already know. If you don't know, I don't know where you've been growing up. So we will touch that. Next week, let me think. I think next week, if I don't hit the Counter-Reformation next week, it will be the week after. But we will have the video next week. On September 17th is Constitution Day, which was the day the U.S. Constitution was officially ratified here in the United States, which it went to, well, not ratified, but it was officially signed. It didn't get ratified yet, but it was officially signed and done. It just had to be ratified by the states. So we will have a video on that day of the Constitutional Convention, of how the Constitution came to be. How did we form a new government for the United States that has persevered for so long? It's one of the oldest still enacted forms of government, and it's held up pretty well. Of course, there's been a few kinks, and we'll discuss the kinks. Believe me, I can pretty much imagine you might know one of the kinks. Here's a hint. When you're counting certain people as only 3/5 of a person, that's not okay. That's never okay. Ever. So yeah, you might know where that's going. So anyway, we will have that next week. So we will definitely have a Constitution video with the little remembrance video on Friday, and the Counter-Reformation is next week, if not the week after. Let me think here. Oh, I've started to just kind of think in my own head of some videos of what I'm possibly wanting to do to relate to Halloween, which is kind of around the corner, and I've determined I got 2 ideas right now. One of them I know for sure I'm going to do, and the one that I know for certain that I will do is we are going to do one on the history of Halloween. Where does this originate? Where does Halloween originate? Many people don't know where it originates. I myself don't know a whole lot, so I'll learn a little bit as well. So we will show you, where does Halloween come from? And on the second video, on the scary vibe, I don't know if anyone believes in this stuff, but you're inclined to your own opinion, but I'm sure many people have either heard of or seen The Exorcist, the movie, with the little head spinning around and pea soup and everything else. I'm sure you all have either at least heard of it. Well, I'm here to tell you that movie did not actually happen the way they said it did, but it is based off a supposed real-life incident that happened in 1946 to a young boy. So, in accordance that it's Halloween, we're trying to kind of fit in with the season here, I will also probably do a video on this supposed case of possession, of demonic possession, an exorcism that led to the inspiration for The Exorcist. Where did this start? This is kind of on the scary factor, and it's also in that kind of spiritual factor, whether or not you believe in ghosts and demons and everything else. I myself do. I myself very much do it. In fact, I think one day if I have a side career, I'm not so sure I won't go into paranormal investigating. Even demonology is a thing. So I will probably do a video on those two things. We will have one on this little case of exorcism, and then we'll have one on the history of Halloween. Where does the what culture does this originate from? How did they celebrate it? So that is our future plans for right now. I just wanted to get that out there. That wraps it up for this video. So as always, if you like this video, if you like any of the videos, be sure to like the videos. Be sure to comment in the comment section below. Give any ideas you may have for future videos in the comment section. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you are enjoying the videos, because that just lets me know kind of who might are there people out there that are still interested in this stuff or not. So if you're liking the videos, if you're constantly coming back and watching them once in a while, be sure to subscribe. So that all handles up for today. So hopefully everyone has a good continued rest of their day / week or whatever we do here. And we will see you either probably next time here with the 9/11 remembrance video that we will have on Friday. So hopefully everyone does well, and God bless you all.